The vast golden plains of the South African bush hold many secrets, but they whisper one truth louder than all others. Life here is relentless. Survival is a daily contract, and for the smallest, most vulnerable creatures, that contract can be broken in a heartbeat. Our story begins on a morning that felt too quiet, a stillness that David, a veteran conservationist who knew the symphony of the savannah by heart, found deeply unsettling. David wasn't just a guide or a ranger. He was a silent guardian of this wild, untamed world. He had spent 30 years watching the great cycles of nature unfold, the beautiful and the brutal. But nothing prepares you for the sight of innocence lost. He was driving his old, dust-caked Land Cruiser along a rarely used game trail, performing his routine perimeter check. The sun, a brutal orange disk, was already climbing high, baking the red earth until it shimmered. That's when he saw it. Not a sound, not a movement, but a smudge of color in the long, dry grass, a patch of pale gold that didn't belong to the landscape. He cut the engine, and the sudden, profound silence was broken only by the frantic drumming of his own heart. He waited, scanning the horizon for the mother, the fierce protector he knew must be near. A lioness never leaves her cub, except when she has to. He waited 5 agonizing minutes, 10, 15. The silence was his answer. Slowly, cautiously, David approached the spot, and there he was, a lion cub, barely 6 weeks old, no bigger than a house cat, curled into a ball, his breath shallow and ragged. His tiny ribs showed clearly beneath his spotted coat. He was dehydrated, weak, and radiating a deep, consuming fear. David knew instantly this cub was alone, completely, catastrophically alone. The pride was gone, likely driven off by a larger territorial male, or perhaps the mother had fallen prey to the unforgiving bush. In the wild, abandonment means death. There is no second chance. David reached out a calloused, gentle hand. The cub didn't roar, didn't swipe. He merely let out a sound so small, so utterly heartbreaking that David felt it deep in his chest. It was a single, weak mewl, a cry of profound loneliness. In that moment, the cub's fate was sealed not by the bush, but by human compassion. David knew the risks. Interfering with nature is always a last resort, but this was no longer nature's choice. This was a mercy rescue. He wrapped the cub carefully in a thick blanket, holding the tiny, fragile body close to his chest. The cub was so light, almost weightless, a tragic bundle of fur and bone. "We'll call you Orion," David whispered, the name of a mighty hunter in the stars, hoping to speak strength into the trembling animal. "You've got a fight ahead of you, little one." The drive back to the small rescue center, located 2 hours away, was torture. David pushed the old Land Cruiser as fast as the terrain allowed, every bump a jolt of pain to the exhausted cub. He kept his left hand on the cub, a constant, reassuring weight. The sun beat down, turning the cab into an oven. David used his water bottle to wet the cub's lips, hoping to stave off the worst of the dehydration. He talked to Orion the whole way, a stream of low, calming nonsense, promises of warmth, safety, and a full belly. When they finally arrived, the atmosphere shifted instantly into controlled chaos. Amara, the center's head veterinarian, met them at the gate. Amara was David's partner in this unending mission, a woman with a calm demeanor and hands that worked miracles. One look at Orion, and her face tightened with professional urgency and deep, immediate sympathy. "He's barely holding on, David. Temperature is low, but he's severely dehydrated," Amara said, already setting up the makeshift emergency room. The next few hours were a blur of life-saving measures. A tiny IV drip was carefully inserted into the cub's fragile leg. Warm blankets, heated by hot water bottles, surrounded him. Amara worked swiftly, her movements economical and precise. She drew blood for testing, checked his tiny paws for injury, and listened to his weak, fluttery heartbeat. Every minute was a victory, every breath a prayer. This little lion, born to dominate, was fighting the most fundamental battle of his life, the fight to simply exist. Orion was placed in a large, secure transport kennel, lined with soft, clean bedding. He was too weak to stand, too terrified to do anything but tremble. His eyes, the color of wet amber, darted around the room, registering shapes and shadows, but finding no comfort. Amara tried offering him a bottle of specialized milk formula, but he refused. His instincts were overriding his hunger. He was alone, and in his world, being alone meant danger. David and Amara sat by his side, speaking in hushed tones. They knew that human contact, if not handled correctly, could be detrimental to his future re-release into the wild. But right now, the priority was life, not ethics. He needed to know he was safe. He needed a substitute for the enormous protective warmth of his mother. They needed a breakthrough, a sign that the small, flickering flame of life inside him was ready to catch fire. The late afternoon bled into twilight. Amara stepped out for a brief moment, her face lined with fatigue, but her eyes held a steady resolve. She looked at David, who was sitting cross-legged next to the kennel, his large hand gently resting against the wire mesh. If you're watching this, you understand the enormous passion and commitment it takes to save a life like Orion's. We pour every ounce of our care and every resource we have into these miracles. If you love these animals as much as we do, please take a moment right now to hit that subscribe button. Join our family and stay updated on Orion's journey and the hundreds of other animals we fight for every day. And don't forget to leave a like on this video to help us reach more people who care. Your support is the engine that keeps our rescue running. Now, let's get back to Orion. The night brought a chilling drop in temperature and an even sharper drop in Orion's spirits. He started to vocalize, not the fearsome roar of a future king, but the desperate nasal cry of a baby. It was a sound that tore at the heart. Amara returned, carrying a specialized heating pad and a soft toy, a stand-in for a sibling. "He's crying for comfort, David," she murmured, checking his temperature again. "It's the loneliness that's going to kill him, not the dehydration." David nodded grimly. They tried everything, playing audio recordings of lionesses purring, rocking the kennel gently, holding a glove that smelled like David's jacket near the opening. Nothing worked. Orion continued his mournful, solitary protest against the cruelty of his fate. He would sleep for 10 minutes, jolt awake, and start crying again. His refusal to take the bottle meant they had to continue the slow, painstaking process of syringe feeding the milk formula, a laborious task that risked aspiration. Amara took the first watch. David stretched his aching back, his eyes glued to the small, struggling cub. He thought about the pride he'd seen a few days earlier, the lioness with her cubs, healthy and strong. Now, this one was a ghost of that image. The responsibility weighed heavily. Saving one cub is like trying to stop the tide, but for David and Amara, that one cub was their entire world. When David relieved Amara at midnight, she was slumped in a chair, holding a damp cloth to her forehead. "He took 20 milliliters," she whispered, a small victory that felt monumental. "But he's constantly agitated. He needs security, a den. He's looking for something big and soft." David sat down, watching Orion pace a tiny circle in his kennel. His eyes were huge in the dim light of the overhead lamp. David realized the cub wasn't just looking for warmth. He was searching for the shape of his mother, a large, yielding, protective form. They couldn't give him his mother, and they couldn't risk placing a human body directly inside the kennel. It would imprint him too much, making his future impossible. David's gaze wandered across the storeroom they were using as a recovery clinic. The room was mostly filled with medical supplies, old crates, and discarded equipment. Tucked away in a dusty corner, half covered by a drop cloth, was a piece of furniture that had been there for years, forgotten and unused. A big, overstuffed leather armchair. It was an old relic from the center's defunct main office, heavy and worn, but enormous. It had a deep seat, high padded arms, and an intimidating presence. It was the perfect size, the perfect shape. David considered the idea. It was crazy. Giving a wild animal access to human furniture, it defied every protocol. But Orion wasn't responding to protocol. He was responding to loss, and he was dying of a broken heart. David knew he had to try something radical. He had to replace the absent mountain of protection with something equally massive and comforting. He had to give the little prince of the savannah an unlikely throne. He looked at the distressed cub, who was now shivering despite the heat lamp. David stood up, his mind made up. "Amara," David said, pointing to the dusty relic in the corner. "We're going to try something completely insane. That old armchair, we're going to put that cub in it. It's the only thing big enough to feel like a mother." Amara looked at the massive chair, then at the tiny cub, and a slow, cautious smile touched her lips. She understood the desperation. It was a Hail Mary pass, a final, illogical attempt to bring comfort to a terrified soul. The long, desperate night was slowly giving way to a new, uncertain dawn, and the stage was set for an experiment in rescue that they would never forget. The fight for Orion's life had reached its critical, emotional pivot point. They only hoped the heavy, silent comfort of an old leather chair could somehow speak the language of a mother's embrace. The atmosphere in the small recovery room had been heavy with despair, but now, with the ridiculous idea of the armchair, there was a sudden electric tension. David and Amara moved with renewed purpose, the shared absurdity of their plans somehow injecting energy back into their exhausted bodies. This wasn't a standard veterinary procedure. This was an act of faith, a desperate gamble based on a gut feeling that a massive, solid object could trick a terrified cub's primal instincts into feeling safe. First, they had to clean the old relic. The leather armchair, dark brown and scarred from decades of use, was an imposing structure. It was the kind of chair that swallowed you whole, with high curving arms and a back that rose higher than David's shoulders when he sat in it. They hauled it out, careful not to scrape the floor, and wiped away years of dust and neglect. Amara lined the deep, comfortable seat with fresh, soft blankets, a thick, warm nest designed to mimic the secure hollow of a mother's flank. She then placed the heating pad securely inside the blankets, ensuring a steady, enveloping warmth. The most challenging part was relocating Orion. The cub, still weak and skittish, was carefully lifted from his small kennel. David held him gently, his heart pounding a rhythm against Orion's frail body. The cub, sensing the change in routine, began to squirm, his tiny claws hooking momentarily on David's shirt. David spoke to him in low, steady tones, words meant to soothe the little animal's mounting fear. "It's all right, Orion. Look what we found for you. Your new den, your new protector." They placed Orion directly onto the soft, prepared nest in the center of the massive armchair. For a moment, the cub froze. He was a speck of gold against a mountain of dark leather, utterly dwarfed by his new environment. He blinked, his wide, tear-filled eyes scanning the strange, silent mountain surrounding him. His tiny nose twitched, trying to place the new scent, a mix of old leather, clean linen, and David's lingering hand oils. It was foreign, but it was also solid. Then, the reaction. It was not instantaneous, but it was profound. Instead of scrambling, instead of crying, Orion stopped moving entirely. He pressed himself down into the blankets, sinking into the prepared warmth. His small body, which had been tense and rigid for hours, slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to relax. His head dipped, resting against the soft curve where the armrest met the back of the chair. It was a perfect protective cave. He was surrounded on three sides by soft, high walls. He was no longer exposed, no longer alone in a vast, cold space. The armchair, by its sheer, non-threatening bulk, had become the closest thing to a lioness's massive, protective presence. David and Amara held their breath, watching from a distance. The transformation was breathtaking. The tiny, desperate cries stopped immediately. Orion sighed, a long, shuddering exhalation that sounded like a week's worth of tension leaving his small lungs. He wiggled, adjusting his position once, and then found the perfect spot, curling up tightly. Within minutes, the little lion was sound asleep, deeply, peacefully asleep. Amara covered her mouth with her hand, tears welling up in her eyes. It was a victory won not through science, but through pure, illogical, emotional empathy. "It worked," she whispered, the disbelief clear in her voice. He needed the sheer presence of something enormous and safe. This moment marked the critical turning point in Orion's recovery. With the emotional security provided by his unlikely mother, his physiological responses normalized rapidly. Over the next hour, Amara approached cautiously and, using a small, specialized bottle warmer, prepared the milk formula. She approached the sleeping cub slowly, her movements deliberate. This time, when she gently woke him and offered the bottle, Orion didn't fight. He latched on instinctively, drinking with a fierce, ravenous hunger that shocked both rescuers. He drained the entire bottle, more milk than he had taken in the previous 12 hours combined. The difference the armchair made was immediate and dramatic. It wasn't just furniture, it was a sanctuary. When he was awake, Orion treated the armchair like a personalized jungle gym. He would climb the high backrest, practice his wobbly pounces on the cushions, and chew thoughtfully on the leather armrests. But when he was tired, frightened, or hungry, he would immediately retreat into the deep, warm hollow of the nest, safe and secure. The armchair was his base, his constant, unmoving point of reference in a bewildering new world. David and Amara started a new routine centered around Orion's strange attachment. They moved the feeding schedule to revolve around his naps on the chair. They documented every interaction, often catching priceless moments of the powerful young lion cub cuddling with his worn, inanimate companion. These moments, captured on camera, were pure gold. The image of a future king finding solace in a simple piece of human furniture. This is the kind of profound connection that changes the way we see the world. It's why we dedicate our lives to the protection of these magnificent animals and share these stories with you. If Orion's fight has touched your heart and you want to be part of the good we do every single day, we need your help. We rely entirely on the generosity of people like you to fund the constant care, medical supplies, and special formulas that keep cubs like Orion alive. Please consider checking the link in the description to make a small donation. Every dollar brings us closer to giving these animals the second chance they deserve. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Now, let's see how Orion grows into his chair. As the days turned into weeks, Orion grew rapidly, transforming from a fragile infant into a playful, robust cub. His spots, which would eventually fade, were still bright against his coat. He began to explore the small, controlled environment of the recovery room, batting at shadows and practicing miniature, comical roars that sounded more like a strangled cough. But his loyalty to the armchair remained absolute. If David or Amara tried to introduce a large plastic den or a comfortable purpose-built sleeping crate, Orion would ignore it. He would stand at the entrance of the alternative den, look disdainfully at the interior, and then trot straight back to his worn leather throne. He would hop onto the seat, circle twice in the soft blankets, and collapse with a satisfied huff. The armchair was his property, his comfort, his great silent friend. This attachment created both amusement and a new logistical challenge. Orion was growing fast. Soon he would be too big for the chair, and certainly too wild to remain in the center. Every animal that passes through David and Amara's care is destined for eventual release, whenever possible, or placement in a suitable, protected sanctuary. But how do you wean a lion cub off his favorite piece of human furniture? How do you tell a king to abandon his throne? They decided to slowly expand his enclosure, moving the armchair with him. The first time the armchair was wheeled out of the recovery room and into a larger outdoor enclosure, Orion panicked. He had been sleeping soundly, but the motion woke him. He stood on the seat, his small legs bracing against the movement, and let out a genuine, if tiny, roar of protest. He only calmed down once the chair was stable again, and he checked every inch of the leather to make sure it was, in fact, the same chair. This incident proved the depth of his emotional reliance. The chair wasn't just a bed, it was a psychological anchor. As Orion grew, his relationship with the chair became even more comical. He stopped fitting entirely inside the nest of blankets. Instead, he would drape himself over the high backrest like a furry golden scarf, his large paws dangling over the sides. He'd use the armrests as giant pillows, resting his heavy head while watching the small birds outside his enclosure. He had, quite literally, made the armchair his own, using every part of it as a lion would use a large rock or a termite mound for basking and observation. The image of the majestic African lion, draped over a dusty old office chair, was the symbol of their successful, unconventional rescue. But this success brought the next hardest step, preparing him for a life without it. The wild was calling, and the old leather chair could not go with him. The days of bottle feeding and constant human proximity were drawing to a close. Orion, now 6 months old, was magnificent. His coordination had vastly improved, his coat was thick and glossy, and his roar, once a pathetic squeak, was now a resonant, throaty challenge. He was still a cub, full of clumsy energy, but the inherent strength of a lion was undeniable. His favorite armchair, however, remained his shadow. It was his companion for basking, his shield during thunderstorms, and the only place he seemed to achieve true deep rest. But David and Amara knew their rescue mission was not about comfort. It was about release. The goal was to return a lion to the wild, not to create a pet with a leather fixation. The next phase of his rehabilitation began: detachment. This was the most difficult and often the most heartbreaking stage for the rescuers. David started by making the chair less appealing. They stopped putting the blankets and heating pads on it. Instead, they began lining a large, purpose-built den, a structure made of natural wood and stone, mimicking a real lion's shelter, with fresh, warm straw. For the first week, Orion refused. He would eye the new den with suspicion, sniff the straw with an air of disdain, and then, with a dramatic huff, jump back onto the cold, bare leather of his armchair. He would try to curl up, but his growing size made it an awkward fit. He'd struggle to balance his heavy head on the thin armrest, yet he persisted, stubbornly clinging to the only stability he had ever known. It was an emotional battle, watching this powerful young animal choose discomfort over change, but David and Amara had to stand firm. They were preparing him for a world where sentimental attachments meant weakness. The breakthrough came gradually, driven by the introduction of larger, more complex toys and the use of enrichment activities designed to encourage natural behaviors. Amara started hiding pieces of meat inside the new den, forcing Orion to enter the dark, enclosed space to find his meals. At first, he would snatch the meat and drag it immediately back to the safety of the chair, eating his dinner while draped over the backrest. Slowly, however, the warmth of the straw and the satisfaction of finding food within the den began to register as positive associations. One evening, after a particularly exhausting session of chasing a large, bouncy tire, Orion returned to his enclosure utterly spent. He stumbled, looking for his familiar comfort. He saw the cold, hard leather of the armchair, and then he saw the dark, inviting entrance of the natural den, emitting a faint, welcoming scent of straw and safety. He paused, a long moment of internal debate written clearly on his expressive face. Then he turned, gave the armchair a quick, almost dismissive glance, and lumbered into the den. He disappeared into the darkness. David and Amara exchanged a silent, triumphant look. The king had finally accepted his natural-born chamber. Over the next few weeks, the distance between Orion and the armchair grew. He now spent his nights in the den. The armchair became merely a daytime lookout point, a high vantage from which to survey his ever-expanding territory. He used it as a stepping stone, a scratching post, anything but a source of deep, emotional comfort. The process of separation was successful. When the final day arrived, the day they planned to move Orion to a vast pre-release enclosure in a protected area, the armchair was quietly removed. It was David who did it. He came into the empty enclosure and simply wheeled the chair away. Orion watched the massive brown structure disappear through the gate. He didn't cry. He didn't panic. He watched it go, and then he turned and walked straight into his natural den. He understood. The anchor was gone, and it was time to move on. That quiet, accepting moment was the greatest compliment they could have received, proving that they had not just saved his life, but restored his wildness. The pre-release enclosure was enormous, spanning several acres of natural bushveld, filled with tall grass, termite mounds, and the sounds of other wild creatures. This was his final classroom. Here, Orion was introduced to live prey, small, non-threatening animals that would test his hunting instincts without putting him at risk. He spent months mastering the silent stalk, the explosive sprint, and the final, decisive pounce. He was learning the language of his ancestors, shedding the last vestiges of his brief, strange life as a chair-cuddling cub. The final and most crucial step was integration. Lion cubs, especially young males, need a pride to survive and thrive. Through careful planning and a bit of luck, David and Amara identified a small, stable, all-female pride that had recently lost a subadult male. This pride was known to be tolerant, and the timing was perfect. The release day was bittersweet. David and Amara transported the now large, powerful lion in a secure crate to the release site. As the heavy metal door swung open, Orion hesitated, sniffing the air. The scent of freedom, of damp earth and distant, powerful lionesses hit him like a physical force. He took one step, then another, his massive paws touching the wild ground for the first time as a truly independent animal. He looked back once, meeting David's gaze for a fleeting second. A look that held no fear, only the acknowledgement of a journey completed. Then, with a speed and grace that belonged only to the savannah, he ran. He ran toward the thick acacia trees, disappearing into the vastness of the protected reserve. Weeks passed. David and Amara monitored the pride using GPS collars and remote camera traps. One afternoon, a camera trap captured the image they had been waiting for. Orion, now fully integrated, was walking confidently alongside a lioness, his head held high. He was lean, powerful, and every inch the king he was born to be. The cub that had cried himself to sleep on an old leather armchair was gone, replaced by a magnificent hunter. But the story of Orion and his armchair remains a legend at the center. It is a reminder that in the dramatic, brutal world of wildlife rescue, sometimes the most illogical emotional solutions are the ones that save a life. It proves that what an abandoned heart needs most is not always medicine or science, but a simple, profound sense of security, even if that security comes in the form of a dusty leather throne. The priceless reaction of that tiny, terrified cub found its true meaning, not in the comfort of the chair, but in the courage he found to finally leave it and answer the undeniable, powerful call of the wild. That is Orion's legacy.